Welcome to My Marten Musings, the podcast that brings you the people behind the Pine Martens. In our first episode, Josie, the Pine Marten Project officer, is joined by Dr Johnny Birks. Johnny has worked on pine martens and other mustelids for most of his life. From his initial PhD research, he went on to spend time at the Nature Conservancy Council and English Nature, followed by many years at Vincent Wildlife Trust, and continued to remain involved throughout the founding of the ecological consultancy Swift Ecology. Although recently retired, Johnny is still finding time to get involved with the ongoing marten translocations to southern Britain. And I should probably mention, he literally wrote the book on pine martens. So without further ado, here's Johnny and his Marten Musings.
So I was trying to think back, because we've known each other for about 5 years, right? And I was trying to think back about the first time we'd met. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first time we met was in a sinister dark lay-by off the A44, because you'd come out to do some radio tracking. Am I right in thinking
Yes,
that?
I think so. I think that would have been somewhere in mid-Wales, and it would have been probably the first autumn
I think so, yeah.
of pine marten releases in Wales.
Yeah, because I didn't know you at all at that point. I'd heard about you, and I was fresh out of uni, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I was a bit nervous actually about meeting you. And I just had the best evening. You were absolutely fascinating with all of your knowledge about what you'd done over the course of your career, and that was one of the reasons we were so pleased that you'd agreed to be interviewed today.
Well, it's lovely still to be involved with people doing pine marten studies, because they are just absolutely fabulous animals. I've been in love with pine martens for a very, very long time.
You obviously know a lot about pine martens, so we're going to start with, if you had to describe a pine marten to someone who had no frame of reference for what a pine marten or what even a mustelid was, how would you go about describing one?
Ooh, that's a good one, Josie. I think I would have to describe it as something like a little foxy cat that can run up a tree, because the pine martens, they're so delicate and graceful, but they've got that, and that's the cat side, but they've also got a foxy character to them. So that long bushy tail, the fact compared with all the other small mustelids, they've got really quite prominent ears and a prominent muzzle. They've definitely got a bit of foxy in their appearance. And so, yeah, I think a foxy cat that runs up a tree, that would be my way of helping someone get to grips with what a pine marten is.
Yeah, that's really good, because foxy cat, we often, when we get sightings in from people, they often say, well, it was weird, it was like a tiny dark fox, but then it ran up a tree. And I think that's a good frame of reference for people, because most people, even in towns and cities, would know what a fox was. Whereas pine marten, stoat or weasel, we wouldn't know one end of it from the other.
No, but people do confuse. I mean, people confuse them in their heads with polecats, because both species were rare and restricted for a while. So unless you're really, really into the mustelids, it's easy to overlook the differences. Yeah.
And you're very much into your mustelids, Johnny. So,
I love my mustelids. Yes, I do. I mean, I love all wildlife, and I'm very lucky that I grew up in a family where it was easy to be passionate about wildlife. But it was my crazy Auntie Molly that she really got me hooked on mustelids. She was quite a wild. She was my dad's sister, and she went through a lot of husbands in her life, and she was never boring. And she gave me my first ferret when I was about 10 years old, and he was called Pico, and I just adored him. And having a really cool different pet kind of set me apart from all my friends, because he basically was a pet, although I did actually use him to catch rabbits occasionally. But no, I learned an awful lot about how amazing mustelids are through having ferrets, because Pico was the first of several, and I actually bred them for a while.
Wow.
And they are fabulous. And so, yeah, it was Auntie Molly that really, really got me hooked on mustelids.
So did that lead into your professional capacity with mustelids and pine martens in particular then?
I guess it did, because when I started reading up about ferrets, that got me into polecats, and then that got me into pine martens. And when I went to university, I still had this kind of this big connection with the mustelids. and wanting to study them, basically, because you say I know a lot about pine martens, but what I prefer to say is that I know how much we still don't know about pine martens, because there is still an awful lot to learn. But anyway, I went to university and I was able to get a good degree, and that meant that I could do a PhD, and the only one available to me was to study mink. Wow. Which it's the only British mustelid that's not native, and it's widespread, and this was back in the late 70s. And so that was my PhD, was studying the home range and territorial behaviour of feral mink down in Devon, because I was at Exeter University. And that was again really, really exciting time. It was in the early years of radio tracking, because radio tracking is such a common technique now, and it's affordable, and there's all sorts of places in Britain where you can buy good quality radio collars and stuff. But when I started in 1977, there was nowhere making commercially available radio tracking gear in Britain. We had to buy it in from America, and it was hideously expensive. And it was a struggle to get stuff that was slim and light enough to put on an animal as small as a mink without affecting its behaviour. I've still got fond memories of blundering up and down rivers on the edge of Dartmoor, following my mink and praying that I wouldn't lose one, because my aim was to recapture every mink, get the collar off, and use that same collar on the next one, because that's how expensive they were.
That's really fascinating, because I always tell volunteers and people I meet out in the woods when I'm radio tracking that actually radio tracking as an art form hasn't really changed that much since it was first invented. It's still about, going out, you need to get close enough to your animal, you need to get a bearing, you need to get a triangulation. It's not like these fancy GPS collars. But I say that the thing that has improved is the sort of the technology of it. So we've got digital receivers now, so we can tune in our animals. We don't need to remember numbers, but I imagine you literally had to turn a dial to get the right frequency.
Absolutely, turn a dial, and if you fall over or slip on a cowpat or something and accidentally nudge the dial, but it's dark so you don't know you've done it, you're then looking for your mink on the wrong frequency, and that happened to me constantly. I can remember searching for days for a mink that I'd lost, and I would end up waking up at home in bed. I'd wake up having had a dream that I'd heard the beep, 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 and then being disappointed because it was only a dream.
Well, I can relate to that, Johnny. I think that is pretty enough standard for radio tracking. And I'll tell you what, I once tracked what I thought was a pine marten for 2 days down Cumridle near Aberystwyth, and it turned out to be an electric fence that was giving me my blip blip signal. So I think that's par for the course with radio tracking.
But the other thing that mink taught me, of course, was the range of human attitudes towards mustelids.
Oh, really?
Because not everybody likes members of the weasel family. I mean, it's better now than it was 50 or 100 years ago, where they would have all been classed as vermin. Yep. But of course, the mink being a non-native mustelid and having an impact on our native wildlife, there were very few people that would give it the time of day. And it was a huge mistake that mink were ever brought here, but I suspect they've been blamed for an awful lot of impacts that were actually more to do with our management of farmland and river courses and so on. Because at the time I was studying them in the 70s, was the most intense period of agricultural development and agricultural change. Hedges were being ripped out, land was being improved for agriculture with damaging impacts on wildlife, and yet the mink got the blame for an awful lot of declines of things like moorhens. People were predicting that moorhens would go extinct, and sure, yes, they do have an impact, but it's not been as bad as it might have been.
I think that's really important as well, because we often say when we're working on this pine marten project that it's important not to treat any of these species, any species at all actually, in isolation. You've got to see the bigger picture, and of course so much of my work is based entirely around pine martens, and I love it. They're a brilliant species to work with, but we can't lose sight of what's going on in the wider world and how pine martens or other mustelids sort of fit in to what's happening.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and again, through through my involvement with pine martens that really didn't start until I joined the Vincent Wildlife Trust in 1992, and that was to study polecats actually. But I was allowed to get interested in pine martens, and particularly to follow up the odd reports that we used to get of pine martens still present in parts of England and Wales. And my friend John Messenger and I at the time, we were allowed to follow these up and see if there was any kind of merit to them. And we did that for quite a long time. But it got me thinking an awful lot about pine martens and what was constraining them. And of course, they're doing really well in Scotland again. And now that your project and the VWT reintroduction to Wales is going on, that's been really exciting because it's put pine martens back. But the biggest overall constraint is that we are still essentially a deforested country. Here in the UK, we've got some of the lowest forest cover of anywhere in Europe. And so the number of places where pine martens can be expected to thrive is fairly small. If your woodland cover is 20% or below, then they're going to find it quite tough. And it's coming back to your point about interactions with other species. What we've been very good at in Britain is producing landscapes that foxes can thrive in. Yes. And of course the fox is a significant threat to pine martens. They probably don't kill them as food, they kill them as competitors because their diet overlaps so much. And there are many studies showing that where foxes are really common and you don't have enough trees and woodlands, then pine martens really do struggle because of the risk of predation or actual predation.
Do you think that then habitat is sort of the biggest concern for the future of pine marten conservation then in the UK?
I think it is one of the big ones. I think there are enough places in England and Wales where we can restore populations, but equally there are huge areas, especially further east and south, where woodland cover is just so low that we can't expect pine martens to really make a go of it. And it would be nice to think that over the next 20, 50 years, particularly in our response to the climate crisis, because there's a lot of talk about establishing more woodlands for carbon capture, it would be really nice to think that people, say, in Essex or Dorset could expect to have thriving populations of pine martens for their children and grandchildren to enjoy. At the moment, I don't think we can expect that because those areas are still so deforested. You know, woodland cover over all of England, I think, is only about 12 or 13%, and that masks a huge variation between places like Northumberland, where it's probably over 20%, and some of the eastern counties where it may be kind of only 5-6%. So yeah, pine martens thrive in European countries where woodland cover is usually 30 or 40% or more, and that's the European average, and we are so way below that it's a big constraint.
Realistically, what do you think then that the future of pine marten conservation looks like in the UK? Sort of not what you hope it will be, but what you really do think it will look like in, say, 30, 40, 50 years?
There's so much uncertainty around, and I come back to it again. You know, we are in a climate and an ecological crisis that's no secret now, and who knows what the landscape and the climate and our weather patterns will look like then. The pine marten is a cold-adapted species. There are models that have been done in Europe to show that pine martens are going to be retreating northwards on the European mainland, and the stone marten, which is a warm-adapted species, that one will be the winner of the two. So that's a worry. Now, we don't have stone martens in Britain, so that's not a worry. And so they should do okay here. I think it's positive. I mean, I think we can be quite optimistic, particularly as there's been a huge shift in human attitudes. You know, people are much more tolerant of predatory mammals now than they were when I was born in the 1950s. You know, they were still branded as vermin. That is a big bonus because it means there are fewer people who are likely to be out there setting traps or illegal poisons and things like that to get rid of the species that we value. So that's a big plus.
You mentioned work that you've been up to Scotland a lot, and that pine martens are actually doing really well in Scotland at the moment. Can you give us a bit more information about the sort of stuff you've been doing? I know you work quite heavily in Galloway, and you've worked now. Don't be offended, but I think you've worked there over 20 years now, Johnny.
I think you could be right, Josie. So yes.
It'd be interesting to know sort of what you've done there and how monitoring has changed over that amount of time, because I imagine it's changed quite a bit.
Our Galloway project started with a very simple aim, really, and that was to find out which was the best type of den box to use for pine marten, to help pine martens, because we recognise that within British forests, and especially the big conifer plantations that were established in the 20th century, they were great, or they are great for pine martens, but they're lacking in one crucial respect, which is an abundance of tree cavities that pine martens need. So we teamed up with what was then the Forestry Commission in Scotland. We knew that there was a population of pine martens in Galloway Forest, and that was one of the nearest to those folk like me who have to come from England to find pine martens that are accessible enough to study easily. So we started this kind of partnership with the Forestry Commission, and they let us put up some den boxes, and that was the primary aim, really, and it was very successful. The pine martens loved the boxes. This was when I worked for the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and that design of box, albeit modified slightly, it's still used quite widely today. And since then we've experimented with lighter, cheaper designs of den box produced by my friend John Martin. And we've found that they're really useful for monitoring, because pine martens, when they occupy a den box, and particularly if it's a breeding female, they have this delightful habit of thanking us for providing the den box by using the lid as a toilet. So from a distance away with binoculars, you can see if a box has been used or not by the pile of poo on the lid. And but also we've done other things. We've monitored the field vole populations, because that's a key prey resource for pine martens. And we suspect that pine martens breed better in years when the vole population is high, compared with the troughs that happen every 3 or 4 years. So that's another fascinating link, that it's not just us, other people have commented on that. And through the VWT and others, obviously I've helped a lot with scat surveys to detect levels of pine marten presence and activity in different places. So yeah, we're still learning, and it's just such a treat to be able to go every year. Obviously we can't with COVID, but we're hoping to go up again in May of this year to check our den boxes, because we missed last year, to see whether they've bred successfully in the boxes, as they do most years. And it's nice to see that den boxes are now being used in your reintroduction projects that you've been involved in.
Yeah, we've got the, I don't know what we'd call them, the 2.0, the new fancy...
Galloway Light Mark II.
Mark II. And I tell you what, my favourite thing about the Galloway Lights is how light they are. Having spent, 5 years now hauling the traditional VWT wooden ones up and down Welsh mountainsides, it is a relief to, number one, have Galloway Lights, and number two, be on the relatively flat Forest of Dean. But I suppose that's what volunteers are for, right? To
Absolutely.
do the den
Choose
box
them
lifting.
young and strong, and then they can do all the carrying. But yeah, the VWT box, it is, we call it the Rolls Royce, because it provides so much insulation and shelter, but they are jolly heavy, so you need a really big tree to stick them up. And that's one of the things we found in Galloway. We wanted to put up lots of boxes at quite a high density in one area. And we found that because it's a commercial forest that is harvested, so at any one point in time, a proportion of the trees are just too young to carry the weight of a VWT box. So John Martin came up with this Galloway Light design, which is about a quarter of the weight of the VWT box. And the martens, they use them just as much, but they haven't bred in them as much as the big wooden ones. And that's something we're working on now. And that was the reason for coming up with the Mark II, because it's got greater depth between the entrance hole and the base where we put the wood shavings for the mother to give birth in. We've had one birth that we're pretty sure of so far, but we're hoping to get more soon.
I mean, you're right saying that the VWT style is the Rolls-Royce, because the very first kits that were born in Wales after the reintroduction were born in a den box, and that was just thrilling. It was actually a den box that had been put up, I think, about 5 years previous, before the martens had even arrived, and I didn't know it was there, and I was sort of wandering through the woods with my radio tracking aerial and came round a corner, and lo and behold, there was a den box, and she had 2 beautiful kits in it, so it was wonderful. And they're so much easier to check. Having our Forest Dean kits were all born in natural to tree cavities, which is excellent for the pine martens. You know, it's what they should be doing, and it shows that the habitat is excellent for them around here. But I tell you what, trying to check those natural cavities, you know, on the top of a ladder with a fibre optic camera is so tricky compared to popping the lid off a nicely made den box.
Yes, but I guess our ultimate aim should be to manage our woodlands so that they don't need den boxes to breed in, that there will be enough old and senescent trees standing in our woodlands with the right sort of cavities to breed in as kind of natural breeding sites. And that's what's been lacking for a long time. So it's really good that Forest of Dean has got cavities. But I mean, what's your feeling? Are they abundant, or do the mothers have to look quite hard to find them, do you think?
I truly believe that they are abundant. I think now I've spent a year and a half in the Dean, and a lot of that on foot, walking around. It is remarkable how many good quality trees there are, especially once you get out of the sort of more commercial plantation bits of it. Ironically, the bits of the forest that are the best for the martens are actually the more touristy hotspots, so the bits that are filled with people. Of course, martens do like it, you know, quite a lot of peace and quiet, but the areas that are set up for tourists in the Dean are quite often much older woodland, much more picturesque, and that's why they make such good touristy spots. And so obviously they're not right on top of any of the car parks, but they are, you know, very conveniently quite close to some of them, tucked away. What I found remarkable actually from when I first started working on martens was that even the first year in Wales, we were sort of earmarking cavities that were much bigger than what we actually ended up finding martens in. We found that they like tiny little holes to squeeze themselves into, and that was a bit of a revelation for me.
Yeah, it reminds me of a French ornithological paper that we uncovered when we were getting interested in pine marten dens and what was available, and it was a study using owl boxes of 2 different designs somewhere in France. And the 2 different designs, there was one bigger one and one smaller one, and they were aimed at different species of owl. And as a complete byproduct of that study, they happened to record the pine marten's preference, because the owl boxes were also used by pine martens. Right. And they showed an overwhelming preference for the smaller, snugger boxes. Yes, and so that was where some people went wrong with the first den boxes put up in Galloway Forest before we ever worked there. They put up these big, airy, spacious boxes with a hole near the top that used to let all the hot air out.
Oh, wow.
And they were used by martens, but never for breeding. So we came up with a very different design. Actually, you reminded me, talking about pine martens kind of living and denning quite near touristy hotspots, as part of my learning exercise, I went to visit the Dutch pine marten working group in Holland one year. Wonderful. A long time ago now, it was back in the 1990s, I think. And there they have black woodpeckers. Yes. And they are much bigger than our woodpeckers. They're about the size of a small crow. And they build nesting cavities, their own nesting chambers, which the pine martens then use because there are so few other natural cavities around. Nice. And I can remember sitting one evening beside a very busy woodland cycle route, and there was a woodpecker hole with a female pine marten peeping out of it. Oh, and in the middle of the day we could see her, and she was just watching the cycle traffic going by underneath her den. And she gave birth in that tree hole later that year. So yeah, it was amazing. So if human activity is not threatening and doesn't harm them, they can accommodate to it.
I think that's the key, isn't it? If it's sort of gentle cyclists going past and it's sort of not too noisy and not too constant, sort of transient, we find that a lot of our martens, you know, just aren't that bothered because they're actually quite curious animal, really. You know, they like to see what's going on, and they will. A lot of the sightings we get in are of people who are walking their dogs, and they say that their dog sort of indicated to something up in the tree, which caused them to look up, which you don't normally do. And they'll see a pine marten just sat, you know, watching the world go by, feeling quite safe, you know, up a tree, but just, you know, seeing what's going on.
Yeah.
What the news is.
This is one of the things I've thought about is the value and the benefit of the big state-owned forests that we have in this country, you know, and obviously Galloway is one of the biggest, I believe. It's hundreds of square kilometres of conifer plantation, and what makes it so good for pine martens is that A, it's big, B, there aren't many activities that pine martens will come into conflict with human activities, so it's not used for game shooting. There aren't kind of big chicken farms or anything like that. So pine martens can live there without provoking any adverse reaction from the human population. But it's their size that is so important. It can create a reservoir population of pine martens that could then expand elsewhere. So we're about to see, or we have started to see, Kielder Forest being populated by pine martens now from southern Scotland, and that again is a huge, it's what it was at the time it was established. It was one of the biggest commercial plantations in the whole of Europe. And it was all planted on relatively poor upland sheep walk. So yes, pine martens I think will establish there over the next 10, 20 years, which is good. And because they are basically in sympathetic ownership by responsible bodies like Forestry and Land Scotland in Scotland and Forestry England in England, you know, they have a duty to look after protected species like the pine marten. So I think they're incredibly important, these big forests. And obviously the Forest of Dean is another one, although it's quite a bit smaller. But yeah, I think we're very lucky having those. I was terrified years ago when the government proposed selling off our state forests, and I think that would have been awful. So I'm very glad that was prevented.
It's a scary thought, isn't it? You know, we could be in a very different situation. I probably wouldn't be employed if that had happened. You know, there would be nowhere to release these animals into. Now, you talked about earlier how sort of pine martens and indeed a lot of the mustelid group are quite understudied, but you quite literally wrote the book on pine martens. You know, that's why we were so pleased to have you. It's such a privilege, and we sort of wondered how that came about and sort of how you went about deciding what information was prudent, what was so sure about that you wanted to put it into the book?
Very good questions, Josie. I mean, I was so lucky. I mean, I've been incredibly privileged and fortunate throughout my career to have been able to do work like this, and it's largely thanks to the Vincent Wildlife Trust, who they kind of invest in projects long term, which is quite rare these days. And I was very lucky to be a part of that. So I was in a position to connect with a lot of other people doing interesting work on pine martens, not just in Britain, but around the world, you know, across Northern Europe. And it's been a real treat, because people who work on pine martens, they tend to be rather fabulous people. Anyway, yes, I was actually approached by the publishers Whittet Books, and they first approached me to write a book about polecats, which I was very pleased and very honoured to do. So I wrote the book about polecats probably 5-6 more years ago, and that it's a bit of a niche book, I think, because polecats don't have quite the charisma and the charm that pine martens do. So when I'd finished writing it, they said, "Oh, do you know about any other animals?" And I said, "Well, what about pine martens?" And it was a very happy day when they said, yeah, we'd like a book about pine martens, because that was my dream, because there is so much charm around the animal that if you can get it across in the right style. And this is where Whittet is actually a rather lovely publisher to work for, because they it's the natural history book series, and they have, from the very outset, they've encouraged people to be a little bit cheeky and humorous, not to shy away from cracking sick jokes.
Sounds like this book was made for you, Johnny.
Well, exactly, yeah. So, I mean, I do have a scarcely concealed sense of humour, and to be actually allowed to write in my own style, in my own voice, as it were, was just brilliant. And I found it a really, really enriching creative experience. It had to be done in a rigorous way, because I wanted to reflect the current state of knowledge. So I had to do a massive amount of reading of scientific papers published by people all across Europe, reading fusty, dusty, musty old reports that people had, done good work, but never actually got it published in out in the public domain. So gathering all that information and then trying to put it into a factual, informative but entertaining sort of style, that was a really exciting challenge, which I really relished. And so it was a very happy period for me. I was actually kind of getting near to retiring from ecology consultancy, which was my day job. And so, yeah, I actually loved it. And I was able to be a bit cheeky, and they didn't seem to mind. The publisher, I had a lovely editor called Shirley. She didn't seem to mind my awful jokes that went into it. And the other great thing, of course, is that I was writing about pine martens at a time of positivity, when they were at long last recovering from centuries of persecution by we humans, our ancestors. There are still problems in some places where people just hate predators for particular reasons, and despite their protected status, they are still killed in big numbers in some places, I'm afraid. Places like around the edge of shooting estates in Scotland, pine martens don't live very long, I'm sad to say. It's not all estates, I don't want to brand them all with the same brush, but there are some where pine martens just don't live very long. So, yeah, we've still got hearts and minds to win, and I like to think that my book has played a part.
Oh, definitely. Well, Kat and I basically use your book as our Pine Marten Bible. You are the Pine Marten Oracle, and whenever we're writing blog posts or whenever we're running training sessions, we always go, oh, I wonder about this, and Kat goes, let's consult Johnny's book. And we've got some very well-thumbed copies on both of our bookshelves, and I give it as a present to everyone that I can who's got any sort of connection with pine martens. And it's always had positive feedback about it. It's just a fascinating insight into both your work and pine martens in general, I think. Nice, easy read as well.
Well, thank you very much, Josie. That's lovely to hear. And they are, they are a lovely species to write about, because they're truly iconic. They are, I can't remember the precise phrase that I used, but because they've got this association with woodlands and particularly with old trees of character, which is what they prefer to den and breed in. I kind of feel that they cradle the spirit of the wildwood in their lovely furry paws, and that to me, they are iconic. They are. I feel that every forest I walk through that doesn't have pine martens in is just missing something. But then I think the same about wolves, actually. I think I mourn the fact that we're an island and we can't join in with the recovery of the wolf that is happening across the channel in so many European countries now. It's really exciting and challenging at the same time, obviously. No, we must celebrate the recovery of things like polecats and pine martens. The fact that they so nearly went extinct just about 100 years ago, and thanks to the First World War, that was probably quite possibly what saved both species from from disappearing because the attention was diverted to fighting battles in Europe instead of getting rid of awkward little predators that we now adore.
Absolutely, and I think that's a big saving grace of the pine marten. It is such a charismatic species. I can't think of another species that you can look at and just think, gosh, that is a beautiful animal. You know, they're so sort of sleek and beautiful, really. And I think that does go some way to helping their cause, rightly or wrongly. I know you always say that people should spend more time with the smellier mustelids, but it's definitely been, you know, a benefit to the pine marten, I think, that they are so charismatic. Now, you mentioned that you recently retired, but I know you, Johnny. I know you can never sit still for long. I know you've got your fingers in a lot of pies, so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what else you've been doing outside of your day job.
Well, you're right. Ecologists, naturalists never really retire, so I will always be involved in mammally conservation stuff. We still do our pine marten work in Scotland. We've got a new project that we're starting again in the Scottish borders with Forestry and Land Scotland, again to do with den boxes and so on. I've got a family as well that I can put more time to, so I've got 3 granddaughters now, 2 twins aged 5.5, nearly 6, they will remind me, and then a younger one who's just 2. Having grandchildren, that partly explains why I've got involved in some quite mischievous activities with extinction.
You mischievous, Johnny? Who would have thought it?
Mischievous, yes. It's not something everybody is comfortable with, but Extinction Rebellion are ringing the alarm bell that we really need to ring about the climate and ecological emergency. I am convinced that we're getting a lot of greenwash, a lot of talk from our government. We're not seeing the policies and the actions that should flow from the policies to really tackle the problem with sufficient urgency. And so I'm doing my tiny little bit to ring the alarm and rattle the cage, and it's all it's kind of outside my comfort zone some of the time because, you know, we're brought up to be sensible and law-abiding and stuff like that. So yeah, I won't say a lot more, but I think it's something that we actually need to do. And yeah, so I give a lot of talks to various audiences to explain what the problem is, because people and governments are not telling the truth. And we need to hear the truth, and we need to act much more urgently than we are. And yeah, say no more.
So obviously there's a lot of negativity and a lot of bad stuff about conservation, and UK conservation in particular. You know, we are a bit of a desert here on our little island. But I wanted to end with sort of a positive note, and I wanted to ask you, what are you most excited about UK conservation outside of pine martens? Because we all know that is the most important. But outside of martens, and even outside of mustelids, if you're keen, you know, what are you most excited about? What is getting you really fired up at the moment?
Oh, I think the thing that I always come back to that gives me a lift is the strength of our NGO voluntary conservation movement. You know, the wildlife trusts, the RSPB, the National Trust, and so many others. We are leading the field in terms of the kind of popular support for conservation action. And that's I suppose it's predictable, because we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We came so near the bottom in one of the surveys done recently, that it's logical that we should have more of an investment and more of a passion for conservation than most countries. But no, that's what keeps me grounded and keeps me optimistic, is the fact that there are so many good people like yourself and your colleagues who are doing great stuff. And yeah, that's I find that exciting, and you told me not to mention pine martens, but the fact that you are helping to bring them back to southern Britain, I think is really, really exciting. It's such a positive project. It will enrich people's lives and our landscapes, and yeah, good on you, power to you, and let's hope the Forest of Dean rings to the sound of baby pine martens in the years to come.
Well, we promised that we didn't pay you to say that, Johnny, but that is what a brilliant way to end our first interview for our Mustelid Musings. You know, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you today, Johnny. So thank you very much for taking the time today, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person soon.
Thank you, Josie.
Thank you for joining us for our short podcast series. For more information on Project Pine Marten, visit the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust website or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at @GlossWildlife. We will be back next time with more Marten Musings.